Let's talk about what OAuth actually is. I like to get everyone on the same page in terms of terminology. So OAuth just stands for Open Authorization. So it's a framework that you can use to authorize one application to have an API key to talk to another application. And that API key is scoped to your user on your behalf. I like this DigitalOcean article here, this introduction to OAuth from July 2021. If you have time to read it, you'll read it. It's well worth seeing how OAuth works. But I'm just going to summarize the introduction here and say that OAuth2 is a way for one application to get an API token for another application. That's literally all it is. And that API token is for your user and it has different scopes of permissions. That's it. That's literally the TLDR, explain like I'm 5 definition for OAuth. Again, everything's more nuanced, so do some more research and find out like where, the little nuance is, but that's the high level. And this article actually has a really nice diagram that I've opened up and expanded out here for you. And I want to just briefly go over this diagram and show you the flow of data. So we have a couple different components on this diagram. We have the application, which is maybe the application is a Discord bot that needs access to your Discord account to do some actions. Maybe the application is a GitHub application that needs access to your repositories or something to do work on your behalf. Whatever the application is, it needs an API token to some resource server somewhere, GitHub, Discord, whatever, so that it can do things on behalf of the resource owner, which is you, right? If you're asking my application to manage your GitHub repos for you, well, then I need an API token to talk to GitHub on your behalf. And that's what OAuth is for. So these are the components we have on the graph here. So let's follow the data real quick. If a user wants to use some application to manage resources on its behalf, it needs to go to that application and the application will say, hey, in order for me to work, you need to sign in with GitHub and authorize me to do the following actions. That's number one, an authorization request. So the application goes to the user and says, hey user, before I can do anything for you, here's an authorization request. I need these scopes of tokens, or I need these scopes for a token in order to work on your behalf. The user will then be redirected to the application itself, like GitHub or Discord or whatever you're authorizing, and it'll grant authorization to your application. Okay? From there, your application now has the ability to reach out to the authorization server with the grant, saying, hey, the user actually grants me permission to do this. Let's sign in with the user and grab an API token. So that's step 3 and 4, where now the user says, yes, I would like you to have these permissions. I authorize you. Go get an API token on my behalf with those permissions. So the application will reach out to the authorization server, which is usually the same as the resource server, right? It's usually like GitHub is its own resource and its own authorization. Same thing with DigitalOcean. Same thing with Discord. It's its own resource and its own authorization server. But what's really nice here is that the application now says, hey, the user grant me permission to do this. Hey, GitHub, please give me an access token on behalf of the user with the scopes that the user told me about, right? With those permission sets. So that's steps 3 and 4. Then once your application has that API token on behalf of the user, it can reach out to the resource server again and make authenticated requests. So it can list your repos, it can delete your repos, it can list your Discord messages or ban a user. Whatever scopes of permissions you gave it, the app can literally do that on your behalf because you've literally authorized it to have an API token to do just that. That's the flow of data that's happening under the hood. Now, really briefly, I want to show you this app that we're going to walk through the code for. So I have this Go app here, and this Go app is prompting the user to sign in with GitHub. So you see I just refreshed the page and you see the app working. This sign in with GitHub button or link just calls out to GitHub and will authorize the user in order to give an API token on its behalf. So if I click this button, you'll see that it says, hello, Mateo, this is your ID. So what happened there is a whole auth handshake was done, a whole auth like protocol flow was done, and my application received an API token on behalf of the user that just signed in, which is me, right? I gave it my own API token. Now, it might be like, whoa, this is magic. But normally, this actually happens. I'll show you real quick the application settings here in GitHub. So if you go to Sorry, I'm hitting the wrong key. If you go to your developer settings and you scroll down to applications and you go to authorize OAuth apps, you will see all of the applications that you authorized to have an API token on your behalf. And I already authorized this OAuth example app. So let me just revoke it for a second, just to show you what that looks like. So if I revoke this and stop the app and start it again and go back to my example here, you'll see that I'm no longer authenticated. I have to sign in again. And this time, since I never authorized this app ever before, it's prompting me to say, hey, like this application, OAuth example, wants to perform these actions on your behalf. Do you authorize this to happen? If I click authorize, the OAuth will complete. My app will get a token on behalf of my user, and it can just make authenticated requests on behalf of my user. So that's the flow. And I'm going to go over the code, but I just want to show you the high level flow. This is what apps are doing out there. When you click sign in with Discord, sign in with Google, sign in with this, sign in with that, you are giving these apps API tokens so they can do things on your behalf. And I don't say that in a bad way. I don't say that in like, oh, be careful. Yeah, you should always be careful, but that's the magic. That's what's happening on the back end. So there's no like magic really. That's what's happening. So how do we build this app? Let's start like from the ground. Well, first things first, you would need to go to your developer settings and go to OAuth apps, and you'd click create new OAuth app. I've already done that, and I have this OAuth example app here. So if you click this, it'll ask you to fill out the application name, the URL where the app is hosted, and then the callback URL where an OAuth like handshake or OAuth protocol should talk to. So those are the two most important pieces here. The name doesn't matter. Call it whatever you want. I called mine OAuth example just for this video, but the homepage is where like the base URL of where your user should go for this app. And the callback URL is actually super important. That's where OAuth will be speaking, right? That's where your app and the resource server will be speaking OAuth together. That's an important URL because you have to actually make sure that your app is listening on this URL in order to service OAuth requests. Cool. And if you were unfamiliar of what to do and where to go with OAuth information, you could always click documentation, open that up, and you'll see all the documentation of how you can actually implement OAuth in your app, which I'll come back to in just a moment. So with all that information done, what does like the code side look like? Well, the code side, once you create your OAuth app, you need to create what's called a client ID and a client secret. These two pieces of information allow your app to be uniquely identified within GitHub, and your app can actually speak to GitHub and do this whole OAuth flow. Without a client ID or client secret, you're just some unauthenticated app somewhere that can't even ask for OAuth tokens on behalf of users. So you need these client IDs and client secrets. Then with that information, you can start coding. What does code look like? Well, you will take that client ID and client secret, and you will use your programming language's favorite OAuth library. In this case, I'm using Golang X OAuth2, which is like the experimental OAuth library or the extended OAuth library, whatever it's called, whatever the X means. I'm using that. And the first thing I need to do is I need to build configuration. So I need to tell my app, like, here's your client ID and client secret, right? Get those from the environment. And I need to provide these endpoints. So what the heck are these endpoints? Like, nobody told me anything about that. Well, every service that you talk OAuth with has its own API endpoints that listen for OAuth requests as well, right? That they speak OAuth for you. You need to find those endpoints so you can speak the correct OAuth flow for the user. Typically, the only ones you care about are auth URL and token URL because that's the normal web application flow, right? But there's also a third one called the device auth URL, which is like log in with your device and it sends you a 8-digit code and you enter the code. There's that flow too. We're not using it here, but I'll show you. Either way, where the heck did we find all these URLs from? Well, I did a very novel thing and I read the documentation. And if you scroll through the GitHub's documentation for OAuth, you'll see that the authorized URL is here. Keep scrolling down. The token URL is here. And then if you wanted to do the device auth implementation, which we're not doing in this app, you would just search for the device auth here and you would find the URL here. I think it's on another page, but still, I just want to show you for completeness. Then you need to configure your application with the redirect URL that says, hey, where's your application actually speaking OAuth? And remember I said that we're doing /OAuth2/callback, which should match what you have configured in your GitHub app here. Okay, so I can close that one. Then your app needs to know what scopes it's going to request for the API token. What are scopes? Think of scopes just permission sets for an API key. And the only scope that I'm actually requesting here is the user scope so that I can read and write a user's profile. That's it. Every application that you speak OAuth with has its own specific scopes. So if I'm speaking to GitHub and doing OAuth with GitHub, it has its own GitHub specific scopes. If I was implementing against Discord, it has its own scopes that are completely different. So these scopes are not like globally unique everywhere. They're specific to whatever service you're implementing OAuth against. So just keep that in mind. And that's it for the config. That's all I need to do OAuth well. The rest of this main file is just creating a logger so that I can log some information, creating an HTML template so that way I can render HTML to the user when they go to the homepage, building my application, so my actual web app that's going to implement OAuth, building that, so passing it the OAuth config, the logger, and the template, and then spinning up an HTTP multiplexer with 2 routes, one for the homepage and one for /OAuth2 callback. And both of those handlers do fun things, which we'll see. So that's the full app from the main side. Before we dive into the actual code for the app logic, let's look at the template real quick. So I'll go to index.html and you'll see here, this is the template that I'm using for this app. So when I actually went to this page here, this is the HTML that's rendered. Very, very small, very straightforward, small heading to show you what the app is, and then some template logic to do certain things. All this is saying is if the application does not have an access token, meaning if the user has not already went through the OAuth flow, put this sign in link on the page and prompt them to sign in with GitHub. Otherwise, if we do have an access token and if the user info piece is populated, show the user their own information, right? That's all it is. Basically, think of this as if you're authenticated, do this. If you're not authenticated, do that. That's all this is doing. And you'll notice that there's this nice long URL here that prompts the user to sign in. This URL is the step 1 in that diagram, which is the authorization request. This is me having the user sign in with GitHub or Discord. It could have been Discord, right? And you'll see here in the URL, there's a scope that you can put in there. You can put scopes in the URL and your client ID is in the URL. Those are the minimum 2 things usually you have to have when you're doing OAuth so that you can tell the user, these are the scopes that I want, and this is the application that you're actually authenticating against, this one. Okay? And that's the HTML. The last thing is the app.go, and I will show we'll explain this as we go through. So the app.go, again, another pretty simple file, but I'll show you to you line by line. This user info structure up here is just the information that's retrieved from GitHub's /user API, right? So what do I mean by the /user API? I mean this API. So api.github.com/user. Notice how I can't actually hit anything from this API. I can't get a response back because I'm not authenticated, right? I don't have an API key to hit this endpoint, so I'm out of luck. That's why I need OAuth, so that a user can sign in with GitHub, give me the API key, and then I can hit this API and show them their user information on the screen. So that's what it means to have the user information. This user information, this API returns a big JSON blob showing all the information about a user. But in the actual code, I'm only going to pluck out 2 pieces of information from that JSON, the ID and the login username. Cool. Then we have a structure that is our actual web app. So this is going to be the web app that listens on HTTP and speaks OAuth and all that cool stuff. So it needs the OAuth config, it needs the logger, it needs a template. So it can do all those things. But then I'm creating this in-memory like session storage. In production, you would actually put this in a database, but since I didn't want to spin up a whole database and whatever for this, and like make it more complex than it needs to be, I just stored everything in memory. So when my app actually performs the OAuth handshake and like does the thing and gets the user's API token, it'll store it here in memory and simulate a user being like logged in persistently until I kill the app and, start it up again. So that's what this is for. And you'll notice that the access token is going to be the user's API token, and the refresh token is going to be the token that your app should be using periodically to get a new access token, because access tokens don't live forever, right? I would never want to give an application an API token that's never expires. So every access token that you retrieve from the app has an expiration date, and your app should be using the refresh token to periodically renew the access token. That's why when you like sign in with Discord and you add a new bot to your Discord server, or you sign in with GitHub into your Netlify account or something, that's why you like never have to sign in again, because periodically they are refreshing the tokens in the background and just keeping your session valid, essentially. And then the user info is in here so that I can render it into the user. Cool. The root template here that's showing this web page, all it does is it's two paths. Basically, if the user is not authenticated, meaning they don't have an access token yet, just render the template and have them try to sign in. That's all this does. Otherwise, if the user has already went through the OAuth flow, given my application an API key, then we do have an access token. So let's actually hit that user API and pull out some information for this user. And all we're doing here is building a request to hit the user API, adding authorization to that request, performing the request, and reading the JSON and pulling it out. And that's all we're doing. Once we have that JSON, we store it inside our app, our in-memory session, and we render the template with the user information, which is what you're seeing here on the left side. Okay, so to show you like real quick, let me run this again, refresh this page. This is the root handler running, and I'm not authenticated at this point in time. So you see like no matter how many times I refresh, it just shows me sign in with GitHub. So we're hitting that first part of the root handler. But if I do sign in with GitHub, now I'm authenticated. So now I can hit the /user API, get user information, and show it to the user. So those are the two halves of that root handler. Cool. And then the last one is just the OAuth handler here. So the OAuth callback, that's the only other handler that's in this app package. This is a fun route because this is the actual route that speaks OAuth. That's all it does. So when you actually perform the OAuth handshake, you'll see that the user is prompted to sign in with GitHub. They click the button, they sign in with GitHub. GitHub sends a request back to my callback URL, which is this handler, and it gives me a code. It says, hey, application, the user successfully granted you. Here's your code. Please now make a separate request and exchange that code for an actual user's API token. So what I'm doing here is GitHub is hitting this callback endpoint, giving me the code as a URL query parameter. I'm taking that code out. I'm saying, okay, great. Now exchange that code for a real access token. And once you have that, store that access token and the refresh token in the application state. And then once we're done with all of that, redirect the user back home so they can render this page and see their information. And that's it. That's literally all I need to do. Now, realistically speaking, when I get the access token and the refresh token back, I should have been storing it in a database, and I should be like doing some periodic refreshing to make sure it doesn't expire. But that's separate, right? I want to show you just the basic of how that works, and here's where this is happening. And then I have some logging middleware at the bottom just to log every request. So nothing really novel here. So when I did that OAuth thing, you'll see that I logged this line here saying completed OAuth exchange. I received a bearer token with an expiration of this time, meaning this one, I guess, doesn't expire. I don't know what GitHub's thing is here. But you see that I retrieved a token and I can show it to the user. So doing it all from the top, I'm going to run the app, refresh this page. My app is now just rendering the index.html. So if I like view page source real quick, you'll see that the only thing that's showing here is sign in with GitHub. When I click, I think I'm actually going to open this up larger and show you the web like network. So I refresh this for a second. You'll see that I just got the root URL. If I hit sign in with GitHub, you'll see that it reaches out, right, to github.com. github.com reaches back out to me, gives me the callback with the code. I use that code to actually exchange for an access token. I get the access token and I redirect the user back to the root. And when I do that, I have all the information I need on behalf of the user. And that's really it. Honestly, that's it. If you were writing a real application, like at this point, I could have logged the actual access token here. Like as soon as I stop my app, the access token kind of goes away because I'm not storing it persistently. But you can see that it's doing its thing. And when I go back to this page on GitHub that shows me a list of all the OAuth apps that I have, you'll see that my OAuth example app is here. And every time I refresh this page, it reaches out to GitHub and it gets information. If I didn't like this OAuth app anymore, I can revoke this, right? And now when I refresh this page, notice my app no longer has a valid access token, so it can't get the information anymore. In order for me to now have the user's access token again, I would have to reauth. So in this case, I have to stop and start my app again because I have the in-memory session storage. Reauth with the user. Since I revoked, it's going to ask me again for the scopes and all of that. Authorize, and now we're back. And that's it. That's pretty much everything you should know about OAuth if you're going to work with it and develop against it. So, yeah. If you enjoyed this, see you in the next one.